Welcome to I Heart Art. I'm Olivia McCarten and today we're going to be painting a recreation of a piece that I just had in my debut solo show at Honeybones Gallery in Brunswick. So this is one of my favourite pieces from the show. This piece I already have sketched up, as it is quite a process that goes into it before I actually get to painting. So that's what I'm going to show you now. Is a lot of it I do digitally before I start the actual painting process, so there's a bit of planning that goes into it. So I usually choose a few images that I've taken on my phone that I like the look of. I think there's a bit of fun colour, something I think that could be fun to work with, and then I just play around with them. So this is one of the images that I've chosen to use. It's just one of an orchid that I had at home, and then I thought I wanted to layer this image as well because I thought it was a little bit sort of plain and wanted to add a bit more dimension to that one. I've also added in this other image of some poppies that I had at home as well. So these are my two base images that I'm going to work with. From here I took them and put them into Procreate. On Procreate, which is an iPad sort of app that you can use to draw, create digital designs, I use the liquify tool and this little handy pen here, and I just sort of play around wiggling the shape to get a design that I like. So I liked sort of the draping through here, but still felt that this was a bit plain, which is what I think led to needing this one involved as well. Whereas with this image, I wanted to keep it a little bit more realistic, but create more of a motion through those petals around the edges. And then after creating both of those pieces, I merged them together into this collage. So this is going to be the basis for my design here. What I then do from this point is I use a projector because I find this saves a lot of time when it comes to putting the actual design down, because I've got my digital design, I want to get it onto the canvas and get painting. So what I do is I use my projector, put the image onto that and project it straight onto this canvas. That way I can just sketch it out, not worry too much. And I also find it adds a little bit further sort of distortion and warping to the process because I'm getting what my eyes see from the projector, not exactly what is on the iPad. And then that's what leads us to this base sort of sketch. And then when I do these designs, often I choose to do as similar to the original colours as I can. And then I like to recreate paintings. I like to create newer, further developed, further warped versions of them, which is what we're going to do with this one today. So I have previously done this design in the original colours, but today I'm going to take on a new colour palette. So what I'm thinking for the colour palette today is something a little bit sort of fresher, a little bit more summery to what the original palette was. So I'm going to start with a nice big bit of my white oil paint. And we're going to be working with oil paints today because I find that the colour comes out a lot more opaque than acrylic. With acrylic, I generally do 2 to 3 layers to get a nice solid colour, whereas with oils, I can do a nice one thin layer and usually get a pretty good colour on them. They do just have a bit more of a shiny effect, I find, which often adds a little bit more effect to the finished piece. I'm also going to add a little bit of my blue to this one. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to stick to more sort of bluey, pinky, peachy colours. So I'm just going to put down all the colours that I plan on working with first so that they're already there and I can just start mixing from that point. Now I usually like to group my colours on my palette. So as you can see, I'm putting all my warmer tones over here, my blues over here, which is considered a cooler tone, and then my big white over here. And I like to leave a fair bit of space to mix with my palette knife once I've put all the colours down. And I might just add a little bit of green as well so that when I mix my blues, I can make a few of them a little bit more of like a turquoise sort of tone rather than a bright primary sort of blue. And I'm also going to just add a touch of brown because I often use brown to sort of dull down the tones a little bit, make them have a little bit more of a dusty undertone to them so that they haven't got quite a bright undertone. I'm just gonna wipe my palette knife. So what I'm gonna start with is I'm gonna start with the center sections of the flowers. So I'm going to mix just like a yellow tone, starting with a bit of white, because I find the color always turns out better once I've mixed a bit of white into it. Now I use quite a small brush when I paint. I find it's the easiest way to get into smaller gaps. Sometimes I'll use a bigger one for bigger areas, but quite often I'll use something that's really small and delicate, especially with oil painting, because it's harder to obviously go over something because it does take quite a while to dry. So I'm just going to start with these little center areas. Now, one of the things I find I really enjoy about doing this process of painting, where it's all pre-designed, I just project it on and then I just sort of start filling in colors, is it's a lot more relaxing, I find, just to be able to already have it pre-designed and just relax and start putting color in. Whereas a lot of the time, like if I'm using something that's a bit more realistic or looking directly at a reference constantly, I find it a little bit more exhausting sometimes. Whereas painting like this, I find is really soothing, just a really good way to sort of chill out and just have a good time. Now, as you can see with the yellow, usually yellow tones or lighter, softer tones, you get a fair bit of pencil showing through. But I find with oil painting, it comes up a lot better, and as I was saying before, a lot more opaque, especially when that white is mixed into the colour as well. Now, one of the main reasons that I like to work with my own photos is because I found a lot of the time I struggle to come up with things just off the top of my head, and I find having a reference often makes it so much easier just to give you a bit of a starting point. Because I think even just talking to other friends who do art or other people that are interested in doing art, people always say that the hardest part is starting off and just figuring out sort of where to go from. So I sort of worked out in my own practice and the way that I work, I find it easiest to just pick an image that I like the color of something in it, or I think there's some cool shapes in it, or as I said, like with the digital compartment of it, being able to just change it a little bit so that it's something I feel is a bit more fun than just painting realism. I think it just really creates a starting point for you to get something down, start going, and then just spread from there. Like that's how I've mainly developed the stuff I've been working on at the moment, is I just start from an image, and then if I want to change the colors up as I'm going, I just let myself do that. By having that starting point, I find it so much easier to get in a flow and begin creating. And another thing that I do when I'm oil painting is I don't often actually wash my brush because you have to use like a solvent rather than just water because of what oil paint is made of. So I usually just keep some paper towel handy and I just wipe my brush off on that, and that generally does the trick. Sometimes if I need a little bit more, like if I've used like a phthalo blue or something that's really intense, I use a brush and hand cleaner and just brush it into my hand and wait until I see that most of the colours come out of the brush. But because I'm sticking with a similar tone, it's not going to matter too much if I have a little bit of yellow come through. All right, so I've just added a little bit more orange into that. I need a little bit more. All right, I think that's going to contrast a little bit better. I might just pick a bit up on my palette knife, just because for these bits I'm probably going to just sort of dot it in rather than brush it as much. Alrighty, we're gonna take a quick ad break and I'm gonna keep working on this, and when you're back, we'll keep going. Thank you. Welcome back. In the break, I have just started filling in a few areas on the petals here. So on my color palette, I've just mixed up a few different sort of peachy tones. So to mix those, I've just been using a range of combinations of my red, orange, yellow and white, just slightly adjusting it in between each different shade that I do, either adding a little bit more orange to give it a little bit more of a peachy warmness sort of undertone, or adding a bit more white to lighten, just slight adjustments, but obviously trying to vary the tone so that I get different shades going along in those petals. And we're just going to continue doing that, but I'm going to do some lighter shades now. And I like to, any color that I mix, I'll leave any leftovers of it to the side because I don't like to waste too much paint. So I'll try to keep using those, remixing other colors into them, and just making what colors I can from them whenever I get the chance. So we're just going to mix some white into what's actually left on the palette because I need a really light color. So I just want to see, I might even just pinch a little bit of this color that I made last. And I think I'm going to add a little bit more orange into that. Now this is sort of one of the things that I enjoy most about working with oil paints, is mixing the colors, just playing around with adding in touches of different shades, seeing what that does. And the texture of oil paint is really nice to sort of just play around with the palette knife. All right, so I think that's the color we're going to use. And what I also like to do is I like to sort of mark out the sections that I'm going to do next, just as a little bit of a guide. And that bit there. All right, and I'm just going to go in with my brush and start filling those in. Now throughout my practice, I like to use quite a mix of mediums. Like I often work between both oil and acrylic. Every now and again I do gouache. And the main difference that I sort of find between them is obviously oil dries a lot, like it takes a lot longer to dry, but the color is a lot more opaque. So you don't need as many layers. Like I find with oils, I can do one solid layer and that will give me the nice intense color that I'm looking for. Whereas with acrylic, it usually takes 2 to 3 coats, although it dries a lot quicker. With both, you get very different finishes. So with oil, I find it's a lot shinier, sort of like a subtle glossiness to it, but it's sort of, depending on what light you see the work in, you might not notice it as much. Whereas with acrylic, you always sort of have that matte finish. So either, they both sort of have their, you know, benefits. So it just really depends on what the work I'm doing, like what the look I want to go for is, whether I want it to have that shiny or the matte finish. Okay, and then moving on to the next color, I'm going to put a little bit of the color I just used aside in case I need to use that later, but then I'm going to mix the new color into that remaining paint. So I think for the next shade, I want to do something a little bit brighter. So I'm going to use this red, which should lighten into like a bright pink. Might even add just a little bit more white. Alrighty. And again, I'm going to just quickly wipe my brush on the paper towel before marking out the areas that I want to use this shade. So I'm going to go in this little spot and that one. Even sometimes like this, because it has more white in it, the white is a lot thicker than most of the other colours. So I find it doesn't go on as smoothly. So I'm just going to fill out the main sections, and then I'm going to use that medium that I showed you guys before, and I'm going to mix it into the paint just to thin it out and go and do my edges in the sections with that, just so that it is smoother and sharper. So just filling out those main sections. Okay, and now I'm just going to mix some of it into my paint. So just coating my brush. You'll find a lot of colours that have a lot of white in them. That's generally when you'll need to do this, because as I mentioned, the white is probably one of the thickest ones. All right, it's looking a lot better. Yeah, and now I can go in and get nice sharp lines. Another thing that I find makes painting in this way a lot, just more enjoyable, less stressful, is because I have warped and abstracted the design a bit. If I go out of the lines, if things, sort of further warp or I make little mistakes, I can just fix it in whatever way I find suits. It doesn't matter too much. There's not as much pressure, I'm not trying to make it realistic. It's just a matter of how I feel like painting it. So if I happen to put a finger smear or a blob of paint somewhere it's not meant to be, it's so easy to just add that into part of the work. Welcome back, guys. So what we're going to do now is, for a little bit of contrast, we're going to go in with some of the blue tones. Sometimes I get a little bit bored working in one sort of colour palette. So what I'm going to do next is we're going to switch it up and go to some blue colours. So I'm going to get a tiny bit of my blue. Now this blue is like a really intense shade, so you only need a tiny bit. I'll show you once I mix the white in, but it comes through, yeah, there we go, pretty immediately. So I quite like that colour actually, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix in a touch of that brown. As I was mentioning earlier, this will just sort of bring more of like a dusty undertone to the shade, making it a little bit more of a natural tone, as much as you can make blue a natural tone. All right, yeah, that's looking really good. Let's go with that. So again, I'm going to mark out my sections. I think I'll fill in this little bottom bit down here and that little bit there. Yeah, so by adding that brown, you can see it's just made it almost more of a denim toned blue rather than that intense bright primary blue. Now, as you can see, my pieces have quite a few sections in them. There's a lot of detail. And as you've seen through this process, I use quite a lot of shades. It is quite the process. It usually does take a couple weeks to finish one of these works, especially when using oil paints too, just because that increases the drying time quite a bit. And I find, being a left-hander, I smudge things a lot. Excuse me painting with my right hand while I say that. That's another thing I've sort of had to teach myself to use my right hand a little bit when needed, because there's a few spots that I just can't get to with my left when I paint with oils. But yeah, these are quite time-consuming pieces. Just gonna keep going on this. But generally something like this, of this size, would take me a couple weeks. So unfortunately, I don't think I'm gonna finish this piece today. But luckily, I have managed to bring in a piece that I finished a couple weeks ago. Same design, closer to the original colors. So this is the piece here. Now, one of the things that I really enjoyed that I did with this piece was when I finished it, I actually brought the colored bands from the edges around the edge of the canvas. Usually when I finish a painting, I'll just paint the edges a solid color and then work out later whether I'm gonna have it framed or not. For this one, just to continue like playing with the warping and distorting that I use in my style, thought I would just pull what's on the front and just pull it around, sort of wrap it around the canvas to see how that would affect the look, and I'm really happy with it. I think it looks really, really cool and just adds another dimension and element to the work. But this is ideally what the piece would look like finished. All right, thank you guys so much for joining me today. I'm gonna keep working on this and hopefully I'll see you soon.